Lecturer's notes to accompany this series are available by sending a large self-addressed envelope stamped with 22p postage to BTEC, Central House, Upper Woburn Place, London, WC.
After unemployment, most people would consider the major economic evil afflicting the country to be inflation. Inflation involves the continuous increase in prices and incomes. Now, comparing prices at one time with prices at another is a difficult business. A car today may cost 10 times as much as a car in 1950, but then a car today is a quite different vehicle from a car in 1950. There are, however, some constant factors in life.
£13. Here.
13 shillings? This is the real substance of inflation. Now, inflation, we're told, has destroyed Britain's competitiveness, has eroded the incentive to invest, has created unemployment, has even threatened the fabric of democratic society. Inflation is a bad thing.
One problem has troubled us both at home and abroad. It is the problem of inflation. Our first responsibility, therefore, is to see that inflation does not undermine our economic position or endanger the expansion of our economy.
Now, is this really true? Is inflation the cause of our problems or a consequence? Now, the answer to this central question depends on what you think causes inflation and whether you think any cure may be worse than the disease. There are almost as many views of what causes inflation as there are economists. But we can make sense of the cacophony. For all these different views basically boil down to those two interpretations of how the market mechanism works, which we've seen is the fundamental divide in all economic thinking. On the one hand, there are those who think that apart from short-run hiccups and temporary deviations, the market mechanism works to ensure a full employment level of activity. On the other hand, there are those who believe that no such automatic mechanism exists. Markets just don't work that way. Now, it's this first group, those who have faith in the market mechanism, who've made the running in economic affairs in the last 5 or 10 years. For this group contains, indeed is dominated by, the monetarists. Before the monetarist takeover, it was the problem of wartime finance that stimulated the analysis of inflation. John Maynard Keynes' 1940 pamphlet, How to Pay for the War, had been the source of modern ideas on inflation. Keynes had argued that wartime inflation would come from two sources: the high pressure of demand associated with wartime production, and the attempts of workers to maintain their real living standards by bidding up money wages. He recommended post-war credits to curb inflation. This was a deferred income plan, a sort of forced savings, which would reduce demand. There would also be subsidization of necessities to relieve pressures on workers' wage packets. The demand side of Keynes' discussion dominated post-war thinking. It was formalized into a trade-off between unemployment and inflation that's called the Phillips curve. The basic idea is that when demand is high and unemployment is low, then unions can bid up wages and employers will be willing to pay because they can raise prices on the buoyant market. Low unemployment is associated with high inflation. But when unemployment is high, wages and prices rise more slowly. This trade-off was formalized in such mechanical terms by some that they were willing to set a level of unemployment at which inflation would cease altogether. It was 650,000 unemployed. Now, this notion of a simple trade-off between unemployment and inflation was totally discredited in the 1970s, when inflation and unemployment rose together. In the resulting confusion, monetarism, the main pre-Keynesian theory of inflation, made a triumphant comeback.
Milton Friedman's Nobel Prize was an accolade for the two basic principles of monetarism which he and his followers at Chicago have advanced. The first principle is that, apart from occasional fluctuations, the level of employment and output is fixed.
The main determinant of the quantity of goods is just the resources available in the population, labor and capital, to produce goods, and the technology they have for putting these elements together.
And specifically with respect to employment, what would you say determine the long-run level of employment in the economy?
How hard people are willing, how people like to split their time between work and other activities, primarily, and the returns from working.
The second principle is that if the supply of money is increased, then more money is chasing that fixed output, so prices must rise.
Over any reasonably long period, the average rate of price inflation is going to be governed very closely by the average rate of monetary growth, so that the one and only way to cure inflation is to adjust the rate of monetary growth accordingly. The theoretical idea is really just a matter of units, that we talk about price in terms of dollars per unit of goods, and if you change the number of dollars without changing the amount of goods in circulation, you're going to raise prices, dollars per units of goods.
So to understand monetarism, we need the answers to two questions. What determines the quantity of output, and what determines the quantity of money? First, money. What is money? It's clearly not only the cash in your pocket, it's also your bank account on which you can issue checks. And it's the credit card, with which you can buy those things you have always wanted but couldn't afford. It is anything which is generally acceptable in payment of a debt. To take an extreme example, in Germany immediately after the war, nylons, coffee and cigarettes were generally acceptable as money. So how can we make any sense of the notion of a money supply which the government can control? Since gold coins ceased to circulate, all money has been backed by the government. That promise to pay £5 that is printed on every £5 note amounts to a government commitment to ensure that you can buy £5 worth of goods with that piece of paper. If the government of Britain were to collapse, then the monetary system would collapse with it. Since the government prints the banknotes, its decisions about printing money are an important component of the money supply. But that's not all. The government also issues a wide variety of paper assets by which it borrows money from the public to finance government programs. Some of these loans are medium term, the government paying back in 5 years or so. Some are very long. There are also short, 3-month loans called treasury bills, virtually as good as cash, at least to the banking system, which holds most of them. Experience has taught the banks that they need keep only a small proportion of their deposits in liquid form. That is, cash, their own current account with the Bank of England, treasury bills, and money lent to other financial institutions on condition that it can be recalled at a moment's notice. All the rest can be lent on longer, more profitable terms. The banks are able to do this because holders of deposits rarely ask for their money back in cash. Instead, they use checks to pay their bills, and shopkeepers deposit the checks back in the banks. There's no demand on the system for cash. Prudence requires that some liquid assets are held to cover day-to-day fluctuations in the public's demands for cash. It's the job of the treasurer of a clearing bank, and this is a treasurer's office, to maintain a judicious balance between liquid assets and less liquid, more profitable loans. In this money book is kept an up-to-the-minute record of the hundreds of millions of pounds which the bank holds in a variety of liquid forms. Prudence is reinforced by the regulations of the Bank of England, which, to maintain the stability of the banking system,
lays down strict rules as to the proportions to be maintained between liquid assets and other loans. Here, then, is a relationship between government spending and borrowing, controlled by the Chancellor of the Exchequer from his home here at number 11 Downing Street, and the dominant forms of the money supply. Since the government controls the issue of cash and treasury bills, it can indirectly control the amount of bank loans. Suppose the government thinks the banks are lending too much. Then it can sell long bonds and use the proceeds to buy treasury bills back from the banks. Since the value of long bonds fluctuates too much for them to be treated as a reliable reserve, the total amount of liquid reserves in the system will have fallen, and the banks must cut back on their loans. The problem is that to persuade people to buy the long bonds, the government will have to pay them a higher rate of interest. And the more the government wishes to reduce the money supply, the higher interest rates must be. Control of the money supply and control of interest rates are contradictory policies. So if you want to control the money supply, you must let interest rates be what they will. And if you want to control interest rates, say to keep the cost of mortgages or lending to industry down, you must let the money supply be what it will. And if the government is involved in a major spending program, building hospitals, roads, schools, and other public works, and is in deficit, that is spending more than it's receiving in taxation, then it's even more difficult to control the money supply. To cover the deficit, the government must either print money or borrow. To avoid increasing the liquid reserves of the banks, it must borrow by selling long bonds. This may well force up interest rates and bring complaints from industry and mortgage holders. And this is one of the reasons monetarists are opposed to government deficits and are so keen on cutting government spending. But even if the government does, at the cost of high interest rates, control the amount of cash and treasury bills in circulation, all the evidence suggests that it still can't really control the money supply. The problem is that the financial system in a country like Britain is too flexible to be easily controlled. It simply creates new forms of spending power. Take the example of the corset. In 1979, the Bank of England, worried by the rate of expansion of the money supply, tightened the regulations governing bank lending, tightened the corset. This worked. The rate of growth of the money supply, as conventionally measured, slowed down. But what was squeezed in one place popped out in another. A different form of money, trade acceptances, expanded dramatically. Now, trade acceptances are basically IOUs issued by ordinary companies on which they can raise money if they are accepted by a bank. That is, the bank guarantees their value. This, for a fee, the banks were willing to do. Then in July 1980, the Bank of England loosened the corset, and the money supply exploded as companies switched from the relatively expensive means of borrowing money through trade acceptances back into conventional loans and overdrafts. This experience, and many others like it, suggests that the quantity of money in the economy is determined not by the supply, but by the demand. If someone is willing to pay enough, the financial system can always supply the spending power, one way or another.
But the sterling market's moving quite well. I'll give you a usual rundown if you like.
Well,
Overnight's 14 and 3/4. We could lend you week fixed at 14 and 7/8. 2 weeks, probably 15%. Might be able to improve slightly. And 3 weeks, I think we could probably get 15 and 1/4 for you. I don't know if any of that suits you at all this morning.
But what of the other pillar of monetarism, the given quantity of output and employment? Here is the truly fundamental principle of monetarism, that the normal operations of the market are such as to ensure that, on average, the economy operates at full employment of people and machines, and so produces full employment output. If institutional arrangements, such as trades unions which force up wages, or governments which spend too freely and force up interest rates, or companies which limit competition, if any of these interfere with the workings of the market, there may be unemployment. But if the market is allowed to work freely, then all will be well. So the best government policies are those which interfere least with the workings of the market, or which aid its operations, such as by means of legislation to weaken trades unions, or by cutting unemployment benefits, or by reducing government expenditure, which would cause inflation or force up interest rates, and which anyhow limits the resources available to the market. If this fundamental proposition, that the normal workings of the market are such as to ensure full employment, is false, then the entire monetarist program is based on false premises.
And this, of course, is exactly what the opponents of monetarism argue. Although, once again, a somewhat diverse group, they basically follow Keynes in arguing that the market does not automatically ensure the full employment of people and resources. The monetarist proposition that the market maintains that level of output is simply wrong. But what do these opponents have to offer in a positive sense? Here the picture is less clear. But a leading strand of an alternative view of inflation has been constructed out of those parts of Keynes' wartime analysis that had been neglected in the earlier mechanical trade-off theories. Now inflation is to be explained in terms of the behavior of the institutions of the economy, the trades unions, the corporations, the government.
The institutional theory argues that the imbalance is not primarily economic, it's primarily a socio-political imbalance. It's primarily an imbalance between the major organized interests of modern societies. And if that view is correct, it follows that no amount of tinkering with the money supply or indeed altering any purely narrowly economic variable is going to lead to a solution to inflation. The problem lies precisely in the socio-political institutions through which modern economies operate. Trade unions exert their bids on available output through the money-wage bargaining process. Firms exert their bids through the pricing process. And in modern conditions, typically the sum of these claims adds up to more than is available to satisfy them. So when trade unions are pushing hard on money wages in order to realise their real wage targets, firms know that there's always a way out for them, normally, by raising their prices and keeping their profit margins constant. And so inflation results from the interaction between unions attempting to realise the real wage targets of their members, bidding for a share of real output through the wage bargaining process, and firms exerting their claims on real output through the pricing process.
How does this lead to continuous or even explosive inflation?
Okay, well, take first of all the experience of the early 70s. Now, that was preceded by a series of events in the 1960s which led to the real wage targets of workers being frustrated. There were several things that all happened at the same time. First of all, the Labour government's national economic plan was abandoned, and the government pursued a heavily deflationary policy, which led to considerable unemployment and itself slowed down the rise in money earnings. Secondly, there was devaluation, which increased the rate of inflation and therefore detracted from the real value of money wage increases. And thirdly, there was the effect of a steady rise in the personal tax burden. Over the course of the 1960s, many workers were drawn into the tax net for the first time. Mm-hmm. These things all happened together, and workers naturally retaliated and sought, when conditions afforded them the opportunity, to recover the ground that they'd lost. The result was the wages explosion that began in late 1969 and ran through into the early 1970s. The oil price increases in the mid-1970s acted in very much the same way. The immediate impact of the higher oil prices was to reduce people's real incomes, and they then sought to restore those real incomes in the only way open to them, by putting pressure on on employers in the money wage bargaining process. Employers in turn passed on the increases in costs through their prices. So I think that what one can call the institutional theory or conflict theory can explain both the steady state inflation up to the mid-1960s and the more explosive inflation that we've experienced since then.
So now we have two entirely different views of the causes of inflation and of the operations of the market system. And these two views lead to diametrically opposed policy proposals. The monetarists see the market as ensuring full employment and the rate of growth of the money supply as determining the rate of inflation. Inflation can be cut by cutting government expenditure and by taking measures to reduce the power of the trades unions. In the alternative view, the source of inflation is the inability of the market to ensure full employment and steady growth. Inflation can be cut by increasing government expenditure to stimulate the economy and to increase output so that the conflicting demands of workers and corporations can more easily be met. Money has no particular role to play in this story, and so the government should concentrate on stabilizing interest rates to cut the cost of borrowing to industry. But we still haven't really answered our initial question. Is inflation really the bad thing that we've all been taught to believe it to be? Clearly, inflation can hurt those sections of the community who live on fixed incomes, but most do not. The really crucial question is, does inflation damage economic performance?
Between 1950 and 1960, Japan and Britain had similar above-average inflation, but the Japanese growth rate was vastly superior. At that time, the USA and Germany had low inflation rates, but Germany grew much more rapidly. Between 1960 and 1970, Japan had extremely high inflation and extremely high growth. In the 70s, Italy and Britain had comparable inflation rates, but Italy grew much faster. Whatever the decade, there is simply no relation between inflation and economic growth.
And what is clear is that inflation can be a painful experience for the financial sector of the economy. Contracts and loans are usually fixed in terms of money, and if inflation is high or accelerates unexpectedly, the lender, typically the banker, loses out. The borrower, typically the industrialist, gains. So in those countries in which the financial sector plays a leading role in economic and political life, opposition to inflation is likely to be high. Of course, inflation can be a nuisance, sometimes a terrible nuisance if you don't know how much your pay packet will buy from one week to the next. And continuous renegotiations of wages and of prices takes up a lot of time much better spent on other things. But inflation isn't a real constraint. It doesn't really stop us doing things. The balance of payments does. Because a balance of payments deficit is a debt that you owe to somebody else. If you don't pay up, then supplies of vital raw materials may be cut off and production grind to a halt. It's the balance of payments problems of the last 3 decades that have been the true crisis in the body economic of Britain.
This BBC book, which expands the main themes of the programmes, is available from bookshops, price £4.95 in paperback or £9.95 in hardback. On BBC One at the moment, there's News Afternoon, followed by the weather. Here on 2 in 5 minutes, Technical Studies concentrates on sand casting.